Hey everybody, welcome to episode 8 of my Musical Moments series. Today we have a very special and actually very short episode because originally I was going to do an episode where I was talking about one specific Tchaikovsky symphony. But you know, when I was thinking about what made that symphony so amazing and innovative and unique, I realized I kind of needed to explain what a symphony traditionally was so that I could compare and contrast the two. So with that was born the idea for my series within a series, which I'm calling Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form. And I'm about to show you episode 1 of that, which as you can guess is all about the symphony. But before I do that, I hope you'll take a moment and click like on this video and click subscribe if you haven't already sometime in the next 2.5 minutes, because that's when it'll all be over. So without further ado, here's episode 1. Enjoy. Welcome to Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form, episode 1. The Symphony. Now, we're not talking about the symphony orchestra here, a musical ensemble of players that comes together to play music, but instead here a symphony, a musical form, or a way to organize different sections of related music that's considered part of one whole. Now, what we think of as a symphony today is mostly thanks to these two guys. One of them you have definitely heard of, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He wrote 41 symphonies in his short life, died at the age of 35, and has some success during his lifetime after being paraded all over Europe by his father as the greatest child prodigy in the history of Western music. More on that someday in another video. The other guy is Franz Joseph Haydn. He lived to be 77 and wrote 104 symphonies. Yes, that's right, 104. So, vaguely writing around the same time in music history, between the two of them, they wrote 145 symphonies. So they essentially get credit or the blame for what we call a symphony today. But the general rules are as follows. Symphonies have 4 movements. They are generally arranged as a fast one, a slow one, a minuet, and then an even faster one. A closer look at each movement here shows us that the first movement is fast, or in Italian we usually say Allegro, but usually it has a slower, sometimes rhythmically and or harmonically vague introduction before launching into the main theme, which is that fast part, and it's usually quite memorable or catchy. The slow movement that follows is usually something quiet and pretty to contrast the opening, and here the composer shows off their lyricism and elegance and their ability to write slow, quiet, and beautiful music. It's usually a showcase for the wind soloists in the orchestra as well. The minuet, then, is just a fancy way of saying a dance in 3, like a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Admittedly, composers often mess with the order of these two middle movements, sometimes switching them around, but this form here is the more common version. The last movement is almost always fast and meant to be a big, impressive finale. Lots of fast notes, lots of energy, and again, the composer tries to have a memorable melody and lots of brass and timpani, and later on in music history, lots of percussion. So taken as a whole, this is the general form of the symphony. That's not to say every symphony conforms to this structure rigidly. If anything, what makes specific works interesting is how composers experiment with this form, push these boundaries, and maybe even break with tradition and do something different. But you have to know the rules before you can wisely bend or break them. Many of my friends who are engineers love music, and I've always suspected it's because, much like being an engineer, music asks us to be creative within an established set of rules. So there you have the basic form of a classical symphony. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 12 of my Musical Moments series. Today, another short episode but jam-packed full of great information. You know, I had a great response about 6 weeks ago to my very first series within a series on musical form. It was all about the symphony. If you haven't seen that one yet, you can click right there and you will find all about the symphony. If you've already seen that one, just stay tuned because today's episode 2 of my series within a series, the series within a series. Super excited about it, all about the concerto. It's coming up right now. Enjoy. Welcome to Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form, episode 2, the concerto. A concerto is a musical form that consists largely of 2 contrasting musical groups or sonorities, usually a single soloist whose solo sections are contrasted with musical passages by the full orchestra. We use the word antiphonal a lot when talking about concertos, but that's just fancy talk for back and forth. Think of listening to a concerto like watching a tennis match, but with a lot less stress on your neck. What we think of as a concerto today is largely the fault of this guy. You've probably heard of him, Antonio Vivaldi. He wrote The Season, which is, well, technically a series of violin concertos. He also wrote 46 operas, 90 sonatas, and a whole bunch of liturgical music,
as well as more than 500 concertos. Although Vivaldi's music fell out of fashion, like many composers, he had some success in life but died unfortunately in poverty, and his music didn't attract much interest after he passed away. But in a small town in Germany, one composer noticed his music and did arrangements of it. This was J.S. Bach. He wrote some famous concertos himself and helped establish what has become the normal form of a concerto, which is as follows. Concertos have 3 movements, a fast one, a slow one, and a really fast one. The musical material is usually passed back and forth between the soloist and larger orchestra. Sometimes there might be 2 soloists, or even a small group of soloists to contrast with the larger full ensemble. The first movement usually opens with a large musical statement by the orchestra, which then the soloist answers by playing the same theme. This idea is then tossed back and forth between them as if they're having a jolly conversation. The second movement is usually more lyric, with a long melody and a slow tempo to contrast the first movement. The finale is the big finish, so it usually has the fastest tempo and the most notes, sometimes too many notes. To make sure the conversation doesn't go on too long, though, the common form of both this third movement and the first movement has 3 solo statements and 3 orchestral statements that go back and forth. Historically speaking, the original concertos were conversations or musical struggles or even arguments between 2 equal voices, where the soloist and the full orchestra would be given a similar amount of interesting and important musical material. During the 19th century, however, some guy named Beethoven started to experiment with form in the concertos that he was writing, which greatly pushed the limits of this traditional form. Decades later, this gave way to a more virtuoso solo performance made popular by Paganini and other famous traveling soloists. But over time, the orchestra, unfortunately, was sometimes limited to more of a window-dressing type accompaniment role. Most concertos have at least 1 cadenza as well, which is a long, unaccompanied solo section, but I'll do a separate video on cadenzas specifically. As you might imagine, the later 20th and early 21st centuries include a lot of freewheeling, free thinking, and very loose application of these rules to any piece that a composer might call a concerto. By and large, though, it's still likely a virtuoso showpiece for 1 or 2 soloists, accompanied by an orchestra that is largely relegated to a subservient secondary role. And that is the general form of the traditional concerto.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 17 of my Musical Moments series. Today coming to you from Sequoia National Park, where we're shooting some digital content for the Sequoia Symphony. More coming on that very soon, incredibly soon, this week in fact, finally, so we're excited about that. In the meantime, take a look at this week's episode, which is a short, jam-packed 3rd installment of my series within a series, Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form, where today we talk about the dance movement of the symphony, the minuet. If you have not done so already, there is a like button below. Please click it. If you have not done so already, there is a subscribe button below. Please click that and enjoy this episode. What is a minuet anyway?
Welcome to Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form, episode 3. What is a minuet? A minuet is a musical form most usually found as the 3rd movement of a symphony. Although known by this shortened form, the full title is Minuet and Trio, which gives you a hint about the 2-part characteristics of this form. Minuets are slow, stately dances in 3, like a waltz, but with a lot of starch. It's easy to think of them as being danced by aristocratic ladies in corsets and men in powdered wigs. The roots of the minuet are indeed in the dance movements of the early suites from the Baroque period. The minuet also takes a lot of influence from opera, where Handel and other Baroque opera composers wrote a great solo tune for a character called an aria. They'd follow that with a contrasting second section. Because the opera wasn't 4 hours long yet, though, they thought, wouldn't it be great to go back and repeat that whole first part? They were sometimes right. But this became known as the da capo aria, because composers wouldn't bother to write out the music for that repeat of the opening section, instead just writing the words da capo at the end of the second contrasting section, which tells the performers, you're not done yet. Go back to the beginning and do that whole first part again. In symphonies, minuets do the same thing, starting with a memorable, slow, and stately tune, usually focusing on the string section. There would often be 2 short phrases, each of which are repeated. But then we get to the second contrasting theme, which in symphonies are called trios, and often switch the focus to the winds of the orchestra. The winds have their moment in the sun, and then we repeat that whole opening section. Mercifully, because we all have places to be, we usually skip the repeats when we go back. The biggest thing to happen to the minuet in history was this guy. I know, again, really? But yes. He liked the minuet enough as a form, but thought it might be more interesting if it was played a lot faster. When he did this, he kind of invented something we now call a scherzo, Italian for joke, because it's a joke how few right notes the string players actually play during a performance of a scherzo. After this, though, other composers thought Beethoven was onto something, and most of them pretty much imitated him and replaced the stately minuet with the faster and much more fun scherzo. It was still in 3 and had a trio as expected. Beethoven also liked to play with repeating the trio section over and over, so often he'd do minuet, trio, minuet, a 5-part form. And even once, in his 7th symphony, he flirts with the idea of repeating the trio a 3rd time. 7 parts? But he knew that people had to get home in time for the 11 o'clock news, so he reconsiders, suddenly drops the idea entirely, and races onto the finale. And that is the general form of the minuet.
Don't forget to click like and subscribe if you haven't already. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 24 of my Musical Moments series. Today, episode 4 in my series within a series, Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form. Today, an actual 2 minutes. If you haven't seen previous episodes, they're everywhere, so check them out. We've done symphonies, we've done minuets, we've done concertos, and today, the Rondo. If you have not done so, click like. If you have not done so, click subscribe. Like I said, this is genuinely a 2-minute video. So for all those critics who said I couldn't do a video that's actually short, here it is. Enjoy.
Welcome to Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form, episode 4, What is a Rondo? A rondo is a musical form usually found as the final movement of a symphony, sonata, concerto, or multi-movement chamber music. Although greatly related to the rondo of the French tradition, the classical rondo that we know today took on greater variety of character and occasionally more emotional depth. The rondo, however, does remain usually light in character with a repeated section. Like the minuet, the rondo is based around a recurring A section, also known as a refrain. In its simplest form, one could say that a minuet is a rondo, as it presents the A section, then a contrasting B section before returning again to our opening A section. A rondo, though, typically adds at least one additional contrasting section, a section C, followed by a return to the A section once again to wrap up. This is your basic 5-part rondo form, 3 statements of the A section, or refrain, interrupted by 2 contrasting but distinct episodes. Episodes are sometimes called couplets, but they are the same thing. This constant return of the A section leaves the audience something to remember, and it's a reassuring discovery each time it arrives. Frequently, this 5-part rondo would be expanded into a 7-part rondo by mirroring the opening section B, or the second couplet, again before the final A section. This can be very satisfying to the engineers and the audience who tend to like symmetry. Rondos in the classical period, Mozart and Haydn were both big fans, as well as Beethoven and beyond. They liked to find sneaky ways to get back to that A section, so it would sometimes seem to surprise the audience by suddenly arriving out of some figuration. What a happy discovery. In theory, rondos could be 7, 9, or even more parts, as long as that A section keeps coming back after each contrasting episode or couplet. But every piece has to end sometime, and composers before COVID-19 knew that their audience had places to go, so the 5- and 7-part rondos are usually the norm. And that is the form of the classical rondo.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of my Musical Moments series. Today, another episode of my series within a series. Series within a series. This is Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form, and today we talk about the big daddy, the granddaddy, the big kahuna of symphonic form, which is Sonata Allegro form. And if you've never heard of Sonata Allegro form, but you like symphonies, well then you like Sonata Allegro form, because almost every symphony has at least one, usually two, and sometimes three of those movements are in Sonata Allegro form. And all this is this just a guide that tells the composer when those themes that you love, when they should be coming back again and recurring, and sometimes what key those themes should be in. Full disclosure, this is not 2 minutes because it's a little more involved maybe than the rondos and minuets, etc. that we've talked about. So I need a little more time. 4-minute, but 4-minute primer just doesn't sound quite as good. So it's still the 2-minute primer, but just imagine it's a double dose of my 2-minute primer in this. And if you have not done so already, please like and subscribe. I recently hit a new milestone in my subscribes, so thank you. Would like to continue to build on that. And without further ado, this is Sonata Allegro form. Learn about it.
Welcome to Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form. What is a sonata? Like the word symphony, that can mean both an ensemble of musicians and a specific work, sonata can be a piece of music, usually a solo piano or a work for solo instrument and piano, but it is also the name of musical form, a way to organize the musical material in a specific movement of a larger work with multiple movements, especially those sonatas and symphonies. The form is actually referred to as Sonata Allegro to distinguish it from the piece of music, but lazy musicians like to shorten Sonata Allegro to just sonata, and that creates all the confusion. But whether we use the short or full version of the name, Sonata Allegro is by far the most common form for individual movements of works in the Western classical tradition. It is extremely common as the first and last movements of multi-movement works, but is also a go-to form, even in the slow movements. Sonatas have very distinct parts and rules about when certain themes should appear. So when composers are working on a sonata, some of their work is already done for them. The first part is called the exposition, and as you might expect, this is when we are introduced to our themes, the rhythmic material, and the overall sound of a work. For example, let's take a simple sentence, like Joe went to the store. For today's video, we're going to call this Theme 1, so we'll write a quick tune made up of these words. Joe went to Joe went to the store, yes he went to the store. Now to contrast that, we need some new material, so we'll add to our sentence. He needed potatoes for dinner. We'll call this Theme 2. It is a separate theme, but somewhat related. This is usually in the dominant, which is just a fancy musician way of saying it's 5 notes higher. If we started in C major, as our theme did, this theme would occur in G major, 5 notes higher. He needed potatoes for dinner. He needed potatoes for dinner. Our next big chunk is called the development, where a composer takes part of the theme and plays with it. They might repeat it over and over, add to it, break it down into small pieces, and especially have it appear in different keys and settings. Jojo went to the store. Jojo went to the store. Jojo went to the store. Yes, he went to the store. Unless you're Beethoven, you might show off a bit by just taking a single word. Potatoes, potatoes, potatoes. Potatoes, potatoes, potatoes. This goes on for a long time before eventually doing just about everything you might think of, and the composer eventually comes back around to our main theme. Joe went to Jojo went to the store. Yes, he went to the store. We call this section the recapitulation, or because, as mentioned before, we're lazy musicians, we usually just say recap. And in the recap, Theme 1 comes back pretty much like it was the first time. When we get to Theme 2, though, it's usually the same, except for some reason, it's not 5 notes higher. It's not in the dominant. Instead, here it occurs in the same key as Theme 1. He needed potatoes for dinner. He needed potatoes for dinner. At the end of the recap, there's usually a little ending, like a coda that's built out of something that came up in the exposition or the development. Needed potatoes. Needed potatoes, needed potatoes. Yes, he went to the store, went to the store, went to the store, went to the store to buy potatoes, potatoes, potatoes. Yes, Joe went to the store. Of course, over the centuries, composers played with this form, trying to be as inventive as possible, but the individual parts can usually be found in their expected places. Composers have even attempted to superimpose sonata form over an entire string quartet or symphony. Even there, this general form can still be found. And that is the outline of the granddaddy of symphonic form, Sonata Allegro.
everybody, welcome to today's episode of my Musical Moment series, and today we have a short but jam-packed episode because this is episode 6 of my series within a series. Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form. That's right, today we are talking about the cadenza. What is a cadenza? You're about to find out when you watch this video. It is very short, 2 minutes and 10 seconds, so that doesn't give you a lot of time to like and subscribe, so do so now. Get on it. So that's out of the way. And very importantly as well, tell me what musical form you would like me to talk about next. I need your input because when I first started my series within a series, the plan was to do symphony, concerto, sonata, allegro, rondo, and minuet, and cadenza. So I've done all those. Now I need your suggestions. What musical form, what musical idea would you like to hear me talk about next? Or none, if there's none. But let me know. Glad to talk about whatever you would like next and look forward to sharing that. So let me know in the comments what you would like to hear. In the meantime, enjoy learning all about a cadenza.
Welcome to Bruce's 2-minute primer on musical form, episode 6. What is a cadenza? A cadenza is a loose term for pretty much any short, somewhat rhythmically free solo performed by a single musician or maybe a small group of musicians during a larger work. The earliest cadenzas were performed by singers who would have a short vocal flourish near the end of an aria or soloistic work. These were intended as a place for the soloist to show off their virtuosic technique. Traditionally, they would be performed in one breath, so that kept them from going on too long, but over time, breaths gradually crept in, lengthening the cadenza. This type of cadenza found its way into instrumental works as well, where the most commonly heard example of a cadenza is in a concerto. In the most typical occurrence, right near the end, the orchestra stops after a long and loud, unresolved chord, and then the soloist has the opportunity to shine all by themselves, performing impressive technical passages that are inspired by the melodies in the concerto. These usually last anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 to 3 minutes or more before the orchestra comes back in, usually with one final statement of the main theme, and the work comes to an end. In that sense, the cadenza can often be seen as a warning, get ready, it's almost over.
Thank God!
Traditionally, cadenzas would be improvised, made up on the spot during a performance, and many performers, often the composers themselves, did improvise. But over time, composers and performers planned what they would play in advance more and more, and even published their own original cadenzas, sometimes for their own works and sometimes for other composers' works that performers could use. Today, it's quite rare for a performer to genuinely improvise during their cadenzas. Sometimes cadenzas appear in more than just the last movement, most commonly with an addition to the first movement. Still, they usually would occur near the end in that it's almost done moment. But cadenzas also occur in unusual places. Tchaikovsky famously has a long cadenza early in his first piano concerto. Beethoven begins his Emperor Piano Concerto with a big cadenza accompanied by just a few big chords in the orchestra. And one of the most famous other examples is by Rimsky-Korsakov. His music has lots of cadenzas for a variety of instruments, but the best known is probably a series of short, rhythmically free cadenzas written for the concertmaster. These show up in all 4 movements of his symphonic tone poem Scheherazade, where the concertmaster is meant to represent the title character herself. Nowadays, cadenzas can show up anywhere. The most extreme example of this in contemporary music is usually found in jazz, where free-form cadenzas can last 8 minutes or more in some masterful performances. But in most music, even today, cadenzas are usually written out pretty specifically, but there is still an element of freedom, usually in that the rhythm is somewhat loose and up to the taste of the performers. And that is a short description of what we call a cadenza.